How do you rebuild a bond with your own child after someone has spent months carefully dismantling it? I hired Renee when my daughter Olive was 6 months old. I had to return to work after maternity leave, and I needed someone I could genuinely trust. Renee came with excellent references and 15 years of experience. She seemed warm and capable, and Olive took to her immediately. I thought I had found the perfect situation. The first year went smoothly. Renee sent photos throughout the day and kept detailed notes about naps and feedings. She followed every routine and schedule I established. She seemed to genuinely care about Olive, and I was grateful to have found her. I paid her well above market rate because I wanted her to stay. I gave her paid holidays and sick days and birthday gifts and Christmas bonuses. I treated her like family because she was helping me raise my child. Things started to shift when Olive began talking. Her first word was Dada, which made my husband cry with happiness. Her second word was supposed to be Mama. I waited for it. I practiced with her every single night when I came home from work, pointing to myself, saying Mama over and over, hoping she would repeat it back to me. She never did. Instead, Olive's second word was Renee. I told myself it made sense. Renee was with her 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. Of course, Olive would learn her name first. It stung, but I understood. Then one Saturday morning, when Olive was about 18 months old, something happened that I have never been able to forget. I was making breakfast. Olive was in her high chair. She looked at me and said very clearly, "Wait, where, Mama?" I smiled and said I was right here. Olive shook her head. She pointed at the door and said, "No, Mama." "Where, Mama?" I asked her what she meant. She said, "Renee, Mama Renee." My stomach dropped through the floor. I asked Olive who I was. She looked at me and said my first name. She said it perfectly and clearly, like she had been practicing it, like someone had been teaching her. I called Renee that afternoon and asked her to come over. She arrived an hour later looking mildly confused. I asked her directly if she had been teaching Olive to call her Mama. Renee did not deny it. She said Olive had started calling her that on her own and she hadn't wanted to correct her because it might hurt the child's feelings. She said children often called their caregivers Mama, and it was perfectly normal. She said I shouldn't feel threatened by it. I asked her why Olive was calling me by my first name instead of Mama. Renee hesitated. Then she said she thought it would be less confusing if Olive had different names for different people. She said since Olive already called her Mama, it made sense for me to be something else. She said she was just trying to keep things organized. I asked her if she understood that I was Olive's mother. I asked if she understood that Mama was my title and not hers. I asked if she understood that she had stolen something from me that I could never get. Back, Renee rolled her eyes. She actually rolled her eyes at me while I was confronting her about teaching my child to call another woman mother. She said I was overreacting, that it was just a word, that plenty of children had multiple mother figures and there was nothing wrong with that I should be grateful Olive had someone who loved her so much. I fired her on the spot. I told her to leave her key on the counter and never come back. Renee looked shocked. She said I couldn't fire her over something so small, that Olive would be devastated, that I was being emotional and irrational, that I would regret this when I calmed down. I opened the front door and told her to leave. She gathered her things slowly like she was waiting for me to change my mind. She said I would never find some good as her. She said Olive would forget me even more without her there to bridge the gap. She said some mothers just weren't meant to be the primary attachment figure, and I should accept that. I closed the door behind her and locked it. The next few weeks were some of the hardest of my life. Olive asked for Mama constantly, and she didn't mean me. She cried at the door waiting for Renee to come back. She refused to let me comfort her. She pushed me away and screamed for the woman who had stolen my name and my place while I was at work, trusting her with the most precious thing in my life. I took time off work. I stayed home with Olive every single day for 2 months. I read to her and sang to her and held her even when she didn't want to be held. I taught her that I was Mama, that I had always been Mama, that the woman who left was someone who worked for our family and nothing more. It took time. But Olive adjusted. She started calling me Mama again. She stopped asking about Renee. She let me rock her to sleep and kiss her forehead and be her mother. The bond that Renee had tried to take was rebuilt stronger than before. 6 months later, I got a call from a woman named Deborah. She said she was calling about a reference for Renee. My stomach twisted into a hard knot. I asked her to repeat that. She said Renee had given her my number as a reference, and she wanted to ask a few questions before making her final hiring decision. I gripped the phone and stared at the wall. Over a year earlier, when I still trusted Renee completely, I had told her she could use me as a reference. I had never thought about it again until this exact moment. Now some new mother was about to hire. The same woman who had stolen my daughter from me and I was the one who had made it possible. Told Deborah this wasn't a phone conversation. She sounded confused. I said we needed to meet in person because what I had to tell her was too important to rush through on a call. She hesitated. I could hear a baby crying in the background. She said she was pretty busy with the new baby, but maybe we could just talk for a few minutes now. I said no. I said this was serious, and she needed to hear the whole story face to face. She agreed to meet me at a coffee shop the next afternoon. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept going over what I would say and how I would explain what Renee had done without sounding jealous or paranoid. Every version I practiced in my head sounded wrong. I got up at 2 in the morning and made tea and sat at the kitchen table writing notes. My husband found me there an hour later, surrounded by crumpled paper. He asked what I was doing and I told him about the call. He sat down across from me and said I should just tell Deborah the truth straight and not worry about how it sounded. He said anyone who met me would know I was reasonable. I went to the coffee shop 30 minutes early. I ordered a coffee I didn't touch and sat at a corner table watching the door. Deborah walked in right on time carrying her baby in a carrier strapped to her chest. She had dark circles under her eyes and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked exactly like I remembered feeling 2 years earlier, untired and desperate and hoping that hiring the right person would make everything manageable. She thanked me for meeting her and I asked how old her baby was. 3 months and 2 weeks. She had to go back to work in a month and she was trying to find someone she could trust. I felt my chest tighten because I knew exactly what she meant. I told her everything about Olive and the names and how gradual it had been. About the morning in the kitchen, about what I discovered Renee had been doing the entire time. Deborah listened and her face moved through confusion, then disbelief, then something harder. She said Renee had mentioned she left her previous family because of some issues with the mother. I felt heat rise up my neck. She said Renee explained that some mothers struggle when their children bond strongly with the nanny, that secure parents understood children had room for multiple attachment figures. I was hearing Renee's exact words coming out of this stranger's mouth. Deborah said she had been very upfront about leaving our family, and honestly, it made Deborah trust her more because she had been so honest about a difficult situation. I wanted to scream. Renee had already reached this woman and made me into the villain before I even had a chance to speak. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands. I had saved videos from that period because some part of me had known I would need proof someday. I found the one where Olive pointed at the door asking for Mama, and then looked at me and said my first name. I turned the phone toward Deborah. She watched it, and her expression shifted slightly, but not enough. She said children got confused about names all the time when they were learning to talk. I showed her two more. One where Olive cried for Mama Renee at bedtime. One where she called me by my first name, while Renee stood in the background smiling. Deborah said she could see why I was upset, but maybe it was just a phase. Her friend's kid called everyone Mama for 6 months. I put my phone away. I told her she was going to hire Renee anyway, and I could see that. She looked uncomfortable and said she had already made her decision before coming, that Renee had excellent references from 4 other families, and I was the only negative one. She stood up and thanked me for my time. Then she left. I sat there for another hour staring at my cold coffee. I had failed. Another mother was going to lose precious time with her baby, and I couldn't stop it. That night I got up and went to my office where I had kept all of Renee's original paperwork. I found her reference list. I recognized Deborah's name at the bottom, recently added. There were 4 other names above it. I decided to call them. The first number was disconnected. The second went to voicemail and was never returned. The third was Harvey Sanderson, and he answered on the second ring. I introduced myself and said I was calling about Renee. There was a long silence. Then Harvey asked in a careful voice what Renee had done to my family. I told him the whole story. When I finished, he let out a long, slow breath. He said his wife had left him 3 years ago, and their son calling Renee Mama had been part of why. He said they had taken their son to doctors and therapists, trying to figure out why he wouldn't bond with his own mother. His wife blamed herself and fell into a depression. Then Renee left for another position, and within 3 weeks, their son started calling his mother Mama again. That was when they understood what had been happening all along, but the damage was already done. His wife couldn't forgive him for not seeing it sooner. I asked why he was still listed as a reference. He said his ex-wife had wanted to report Renee to a nanny agency, but he just wanted to move on. He had been giving neutral references for 3 years, hoping no one would actually call. He gave me one more name, Judy Larson. I called the next morning. The phone rang 4 times. When someone picked up, I asked if this was Judy, and she said yes. I told her my name and said I was calling about Renee. There was silence. Then I heard crying. Judy asked how I got her number. When I said Harvey Sanderson, she cried harder. She said she thought she was the only one. She thought something was wrong with her as a mother. I told her she wasn't alone. She cried for a while, and I waited. Then she started talking. She said her daughter was 8 now and still sometimes slipped and called her by her first name when she was tired or upset. Renee had worked for them for 2 years, and by the end, her daughter would run past Judy every single day to get to Renee. Judy spent thousands on therapy trying to figure out what she had done wrong. The therapist kept asking about her own childhood and her confidence as a parent. She started believing she wasn't meant to be a mother because her daughter so clearly preferred someone else. Then Renee left for another position. Her daughter cried for weeks. Then slowly things changed. She started coming to Judy for comfort again. Started calling her mom again. Started choosing her. That was when Judy understood it wasn't her fault. I asked if she would be willing to warn Deborah with me. Judy went quiet. Then she said no. She said she couldn't relive that time. Her husband had made her promise to stop talking about Renee because it was making her depressed and angry. She said I should let it go too. That Renee was like a black hole that swallowed your peace and I would never get closure or justice. I thanked her and we hung up. I sat in my car and thought about how many mothers Renee had damaged and silenced over 15 years. How many of us were out there thinking we were alone, thinking we were bad mothers, thinking our children didn't love us because of something we did wrong. 2 weeks went by. Then Deborah called. She was crying. She said she had started noticing small things. Renee redirecting the baby's attention away from her when she came home from work. Renee saying Mama this and Mama that even though the baby was too young to understand words. Her husband thought she was being paranoid, but she couldn't shake the feeling that I had been telling the truth. We met at a park near her house on a Saturday morning. I brought Olive. We found a spot where we could watch Renee with Deborah's baby from a distance without being seen. Renee was pushing a stroller near the swings. She took the baby out, put her in a swing, and pushed gently and talked to her. Olive was playing on the slide nearby. She went down once and climbed back up. Then she stopped at the top and stared across the playground. I followed her gaze. She was looking at Renee. I held my breath. Would Olive run over? Would she call out for Mama Renee? Would all the work I had done to rebuild our bond collapse right here in this park? Olive stared for a long moment. Renee didn't notice. She was focused entirely on the baby in the swing. Then Olive climbed down from the slide and walked back to me. She tugged on my jacket and asked if that was the lady who used to play with her. I said yes. Olive looked back at Renee one more time. Then she shrugged and said okay and went back to the slide. A wave of relief moved through me so completely I had to steady myself. Renee didn't have power over her anymore. My daughter knew who her mother was. Deborah watched the whole thing. When she looked at me, I could see she finally understood. That night, I decided to write about what had happened, to post it in local parenting groups so other mothers would know the warning signs. My husband warned me it might get messy. I said I didn't care. I was done being quiet. I spent 3 days writing and rewriting. I tried to be fair but completely honest. I included the manipulation patterns, the gradual name changes, the way Renee redirected children's attention away from parents. I wrote about Harvey's son and Judy's daughter. I posted it in 5 parenting forums using my real name. It was shared hundreds of times in the first week. My inbox filled with messages from mothers thanking me for speaking up. Some said they'd had similar experiences with different nannies. Some said they had almost hired Renee but decided against it after reading my post. 3 more families reached out privately, too ashamed to talk about it before, convinced they were bad mothers, certain no one would believe them. One woman said her son still had attachment issues at 10 years old because of what Renee had done when he was a toddler. Deborah messaged 4 days after I posted. She had fired Renee that morning. She said she caught her teaching the baby to reach for her instead of Deborah during fussy periods. She had watched through a crack in the door one afternoon and seen Renee holding the baby close and whispering Mama's here over and over. 2 weeks after I posted the story, an envelope arrived from a law law firm. Inside was a letter demanding I remove all posts and pay $20,000 or face a lawsuit for defamation. My hands shook as I called my husband. We had dinner that night with his cousin who works in family law. She read the letter carefully and looked up and said, "Truth was a complete defense against defamation. That Renee's lawyer was trying to scare me into silence, but would have a hard time winning in court." She offered to write a response letter explaining why the lawsuit had no merit. 2 months passed. Nothing happened. Renee never filed. Then Deborah called and said she heard through another parent that Renee had moved to a different state. Word had spread through our local community and no one would hire her anymore. She had left to start fresh somewhere people didn't know her history. I still think about Renee sometimes. I wonder what drove her to do what she did. Whether she genuinely loved the children she cared for, or whether it was always about control. My therapist says it can be both things at once. That Renee might have truly cared about the children while also needing to be the most important person in their lives. That doesn't make what she did less wrong, even if her feelings were real. Olive is 3 now, and doing beautifully. She calls me mama without any hesitation or confusion. She sometimes mentions the lady who used to watch her before her current babysitter. She doesn't remember Renee's name and she doesn't ask about her. She just knows there was someone before and there is someone now. Our family healed. And I learned that protecting the people I love sometimes means being uncomfortable and standing up for what is right. Even when other people tell me I am overreacting. I was not overreacting. I was her mother. I was always her mother. Subscribe, because some battles are fought quietly in living rooms and coffee shops and parenting forums, and they matter just as much as any other kind. News stories every week. Hit that button.